Hello everyone, I'm Darcy Bono, and in this video we're going to cover how to make some rugged, weathered yellow armor like you see on this Imperial Fist phone case here. Now this is an impromptu video. I didn't plan on actually doing this. I just kept losing my phone and misplacing it because it's a dark green color and kept just blending in with every dark surface I put it on. So I had the idea just to repaint it a very vivid color. And then I remembered, oh wait a minute, the Imperial Fist Combat Patrol just came out. Darn it, Lysander just got an update. This is my old one, by the way. I'm very proud of it, so I'm just blatantly showing it off here. But anyway, I chose to paint my phone case Imperial Fist yellow as they're my favorite chapter. I do already have an Imperial Fist video. It was one of my earliest videos that's honestly probably due for an update, but you can absolutely still use it to paint your infantry. The technique I'm about to show you is probably better for something like a dreadnought or a tank, as it does involve two different cans of spray, which, while great for larger surfaces, might obstruct smaller details on smaller models. But you can absolutely use the techniques in the weathering section of this video on any yellow armor regardless of model size. So the very first step, since I was starting with a dark surface, I needed to make it very light. When you're working with yellow or red or any kind of transparent warm color, you're going to want to prime it white in order for the subsequent layer to be bright and vivid. Otherwise, you are going to be spending a lot of paint and a lot of time and a lot of layers trying to cover up a dark surface with a paint like yellow or red. This Rustoleum UltraCoverage spray is just fantastic. It is $7 at virtually any hardware store. Lowe's carries it, Home Depot carries it, and it absolutely lives up to its name as far as the coverage goes. Just a couple spritzes of this, even though it's white, still covered up the black almost instantly without being too thick or too kind of like drippy like some primers can be. So I highly recommend this particular paint for if you need to prime any sort of large surface. And they have a ton of different colors, but even their white is really smooth and opaque. Once that was dry, in order to get that rich golden yellow, I then sprayed it again using Vallejo yellow spray. This is also a primer, but you can use basically any yellow spray paint you want at this point, or an airbrush if you have one. Alternatively, if you don't want to use another spray, you can always base coat this by sponging on layers of something like Yriel Yellow if you thin it to base coat consistency. Imperial Fist Yellow straight from the pot, that is a great bold yellow. You can see that in my previous tutorial on Imperial Fist armor, but just coating that bright white base in another spray of yellow is the easiest, fastest way of going about it. Now that we've got our gorgeous, smooth, golden yellow base coat here, let's add some color variation so this will look a little bit more like weathered armor. All we're going to be using for this is a piece of foam or a piece of sponge. Either one will work. And then you're just going to be sponging on some transparent burnt orange. And you can use either Guilliman Flesh contrast for a more subtle change in hue, or something more intense like Gorgrunta Fur. And I understand that from this image they look almost the same, but I can assure you Guilliman Flesh is much more transparent, while Gorgrunta Fur is much more saturated, and I generally reserve that for the deepest recesses. So since this is a flat surface, there aren't that many deep recesses, we're going to go with a more subtle change in hue first and sponge on some Guilliman Flesh. This has been thinned with just a little bit of water, and I used water instead of medium because medium's generally good for having control, but in this case we don't really need control, we just want the paint to be more transparent. And then immediately after I apply the sponging, I then go in with a large makeup brush. This is a foundation brush. It's got very densely packed bristles. It's great for stippling and feathering out these splotches so you get a more subtle color transition between the light yellow and the more grungy tones. And then you can just repeat the process as you wish, depending on how splotchy you want this to be. So right now I'm just applying a little bit more to the top just because I didn't add very much up there. And you can be pretty haphazard with this. You don't really need to be careful, because if you overdo it, if you apply too much, just remember you can always take that stippling makeup brush and pat away at it a little bit harder. But right now I'm just lightly patting it so that way it doesn't come up, it doesn't soak into the brush, it just spreads out and provides just a little bit more color variation so we don't end up with a completely uniform yellow. And just so you can see the difference between Guilliman Flesh and Gorgrunta Fur, this is the same Guilliman Flesh glaze, it's just a light color transition. You can see it darkens it just a little bit. But if you'd like something a bit more intense, something that really saturates those recesses, I recommend using Gorgrunta Fur. This contrast paint is way more saturated than Guilliman Flesh, so you do need to thin it a little bit more. This is 1 drop of Gorgrunta Fur mixed with 3 drops of water. And right away you see it sink into the recesses and creates a little bit more definition. Now you can kind of flavor this step to taste depending on how dark you want this to be, but I'm going to go ahead and just apply it all over the edges just so the front looks extra bright in comparison to this grungier yellow that we're creating on the side. And again, just to create a little more contrast, I'm going to put more on the bottom. I'm going to make the bottom of the phone look a little bit more weathered and grungy than the rest of it. It just will create more of a color transition from dark to light. So again, I'm applying Gorgrunta here, and you're going to see me really coat these recesses. And this is why I like working with contrast paints. You can just dab it in there, take your finger, wipe it away. Now you may have seen a similar technique with artists using oil paints for this. It's just a grungy recess shade, but I like using these compared to oils just because they don't take so long to dry, and I can use Gorgrunta Fur to paint things outside of just grungy recesses, things like leather and even auburn hair. So their shorter drying time as well as the versatility of what you can paint with them is why I prefer contrast paints when doing my recess shading. I then used the science behind something called capillary action to define this very narrow recess here at the bottom. I first lined it with just straight up water and then immediately went in and applied my Gorgrunta Fur contrast. As you'll see, it instantly diffuses once it hits that water, and then I just haphazardly spread it out. I really didn't have too much of a game plan other than to make the bottom grungier than the rest of the phone case. So here is the stippling brush, and then I realized, you know what, it's so dense right now, I may as well just spread it around with my finger because I'm going to be adding more sponging to this anyway. So it stays in the recess, and then any of the overflow I just kind of smeared away. I then went in with the same thinned Gorgrunta Fur that we used on the sides, just lightly sponged that in just to give it a little bit more of a grungy color transition. And by the way, here's something I probably should have mentioned earlier. I know I've mentioned it in other videos, but I'll do it again in this one. In order to get that very fine speckled pattern you see at the very bottom, that is done by having very little paint on your sponge. So when you first dip your sponge into your contrast paint, do not apply it directly to the miniature. Pat off most of it onto a piece of paper so you have an idea of what your pattern is going to look like. And the less paint you have soaked into your sponge and the lighter your touch, the more of a very fine flecked speckle pattern is what you will get as a result. Okay, this next step is way more obvious to your eye than my poor camera that's having a hard time picking up a difference in hue, but all I'm doing is sponging on lightened Yriel Yellow, and by that I mean it's just Yriel Yellow with the tiniest little speck of white in it just to lighten it a little bit, because otherwise it's the same color as our initial yellow tone was. Weathering is all about creating texture, and you do that by creating layers. So I'm just layering on this lightened Yriel Yellow all along these edges, because that's where I'm going to be putting my chipping as well. Next, we're going to be adding just a fine highlight to this, just slightly more white in our Yriel Yellow, just so it's a little bit brighter than the first time. And we're going to apply this only on the edges, very finely on the edges, as you can see there. That's going to provide the foundation for our chipping. So I'm just lightly patting this around the edges, and if you'd like a more scraped, kind of like scuffed look, you can always swipe just as you press down. So not too hard. I recommend practicing somewhere that's not super obvious or visible until you're comfortable with it, but you can get some nice scratches like that. So just lightly press this around until you're satisfied with the amount of chipping that's been built up. And for our final step in the chipping process, all we're going to do is just very lightly apply just the slightest sponging of Rhinox Hide. Any dark reddish brown will work for this, but as far as Citadel colors go, this is a great kind of dark rust color. So I'm just very lightly patting this around the edges. I'm not putting it around the entire edge. You want to have a very light touch when you sponge this on, because you don't want this to overpower the previous layer of the light yellow. You kind of want it to sit just kind of inside each of those splotches of light yellow. And with the rugged yellow armor finished, I decided I was just going to slap on a decal and call it good. So in the future, we will have a video on best practices when it comes to decal work. My husband is a scale modeler and has been doing this for years, so he is an absolute expert in that. So what I'm about to show you is me doing the lazy man's version. Since this is a flat surface, I didn't really have to worry too much about the decal adhering properly, so all I did was apply a layer of microset decal solution directly to the painted surface. I didn't then varnish in between. Varnishing in between does allow for a little bit better adhesion, but again, that wasn't a factor in this case due to this being a flat surface. So I just applied microset directly to the painted yellow. Then I took the decal that had been sitting in water until it was soft enough to easily slide off the transfer sheet, and then using tweezers and a wide filbert brush, I just gently pushed that off the sheet directly onto the microsole. I like using filbert style brushes for this just because they're nice and wide and really help flatten out the decal. And once the decal was completely dried, it looked like this. I was very happy with this. You can absolutely stop there. But just since this is such a rugged texture and we added all that chipping, we also need to chip our decal as well. So in order to do that, I'm just doing the same sponging process using Yriel Yellow. And in order to prevent the paint from rubbing off, as I'm going to be handling this quite a bit, I did apply a couple coats of Munitorum varnish. But with all the chipping on here, it very well could look quite natural if the paint does start to rub off. And if it does, it's no big deal. I can touch it back up and just hit it with a gloss varnish. They're generally a little more heavy duty, and then follow up with a matte to dull the shine back down. So there's plenty of options if this doesn't hold up. But either way, that is how you paint rugged, weathered yellow armor. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new, and that you can apply these techniques to your own miniatures. If you did enjoy this video and you'd like to support the channel, you can go shopping at any of the affiliate links listed in the video description. For example, you can support the creation of future videos simply by shopping at Wargame Portal. They are an online retailer of everything wargaming related, from miniatures to hobby supplies, so check them out if you'd like to treat yourself but also support the channel at the same time. Thanks so much for watching, and until we meet again, happy painting everyone!